The gunshot that split the morning air sent every bird within a mile into panicked flight, and Ezra Cross did not even flinch as he continued skinning the elk he had brought down at dawn. It was October 1873 in the Montana Territory, and the mountains around him wore their autumn colors like a patchwork quilt of gold and crimson. The shot had come from the valley below, probably some fool miner or a hunter who did not know these peaks the way Ezra did. He had lived in these mountains for 8 years now, ever since the war had ended, and he had decided that civilization held nothing for him anymore. At 32 years old, his body was all corded muscle and weathered strength, his dark hair falling past his shoulders because he only cut it twice a year when he made the journey down to the trading post. His hands worked the knife with practiced efficiency, separating hide from meat, his movements economical and sure. The elk would feed him for weeks if he smoked the meat properly, and the hide would fetch a decent price when he finally made his way down the mountain. Ezra lived in a cabin he had built himself 3 miles up from the nearest trail, tucked into a canyon where a spring provided fresh water year-round. It was a good life, he told himself. Quiet, simple, no one to answer to, no one to disappoint, no one to watch die. The war had taught him that caring about people only led to loss, and he had lost enough for one lifetime. His brother, his best friend, half his regiment in a single bloody afternoon at Chickamauga. When he closed his eyes at night, he still sometimes heard the screaming, still smelled the copper tang of blood and black powder smoke. But up here, with nothing but the wind in the pines and the elk bugling in the valleys, those memories grew dimmer with each passing season. He finished with the elk by mid-afternoon, hanging the meat in his smokehouse and stretching the hide on a frame to scrape clean. His cabin was sturdy and well-built, with a stone fireplace he had mortared himself and shutters that kept out the worst of the winter winds. He had a good rifle, a better knife, and everything he needed within reach. Books lined one shelf, volumes he had carried up the mountain years ago and read so many times he could recite passages from memory. A tin bathtub hung on the outside wall, and he filled it once a week from heated water, maintaining the habits of civilization even this far from it. His beard was trimmed short, his clothes patched but clean. He was not a savage, no matter what the folks down in Sweetwater might think of the mountain man who only came to town 4 times a year. The trading post sat at the base of the mountains, where Sweetwater Creek ran fast and cold from the high country. It was not much of a town, just a collection of rough buildings that served the miners working claims up in the hills and the occasional homesteader trying to carve out a life in this hard country. Ezra usually timed his visits to avoid as many people as possible, coming in early morning or late evening when the saloon was quiet and the mercantile less crowded. He would sell his furs and hides, stock up on supplies he could not make or hunt himself, perhaps share a drink with Tom Murphy, who ran the trading post, and then head back up the mountain before anyone could ask him too many questions or expect him to be sociable. But November came with an early snow that year, and Ezra found himself running low on coffee and ammunition earlier than expected. He waited out a 3-day blizzard in his cabin, watching the snow pile up past his windows, and when it finally cleared, he knew he needed to make the journey down before the next storm hit. He loaded his pack with furs and the elk hide, checked his rifle, and started down the mountain in the gray light before dawn. The trail was treacherous with new snow, but his legs were strong and his footing sure. He had walked this path so many times, he could have done it blind. Sweetwater was busier than he expected when he arrived just after noon. The stage had come through that morning, apparently, and there were more people on the street than usual. Ezra kept his eyes down and his hat pulled low as he made his way to the trading post. Tom Murphy greeted him with a gap-toothed grin and a hearty handshake, clearly happy to see another familiar face before winter set in for good. "Ezra Cross, you old bear! Thought maybe you had frozen up there and I would not see you until spring thaw." "Takes more than a little snow to keep me down," Ezra replied, dumping his pack on the counter. "Need to stock up. Looks like it is going to be a hard winter." They dickered over prices in the comfortable way of men who had been doing business together for years. Ezra got a fair shake for his furs and the elk hide, and in return, he loaded up on coffee, beans, flour, salt, and 2 boxes of ammunition. He was loading his pack when he heard raised voices from outside. Through the window, he could see a small crowd gathered near the stagecoach. A man in a fancy suit was gesturing angrily while the stage driver stood with his arms crossed, clearly unmoved by whatever argument was being made. "What is that about?" Ezra asked, more out of idle curiosity than actual interest. Tom snorted. "Stage lost a wheel about 5 miles back. Driver says they are not going anywhere until it is fixed, which will not be until tomorrow at the earliest. That fancy fellow is a banker from Denver, and he's none too happy about spending the night in Sweetwater. Got his wife with him, too. Pretty little thing. Looks about as happy as a cat in a rainstorm." Ezra grunted noncommittally and finished securing his pack. He had no interest in the problems of city folk who wandered into country they were not prepared for. He settled his bill with Tom, shook his hand, and headed for the door. His plan was to stop at the saloon for one drink and maybe some hot food before heading back up the mountain. He could make it halfway home before dark if he left within the hour, and that would put him back in his cabin by mid-morning tomorrow. The saloon was called the Gold Strike, and it was about what you would expect in a town like Sweetwater. Rough wooden floors, rougher clientele, and whiskey that could strip paint. But the stew was usually edible, and the bartender, a former army cook named Pete, knew how to make biscuits that were actually worth eating. Ezra pushed through the doors and was immediately hit by the warmth from the potbelly stove and the smell of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. He found a spot at the far end of the bar where he could put his back to the wall and see the whole room, old habits from the war that had never left him. Pete nodded in greeting and poured him a whiskey without being asked. "Stew today is elk if you are interested. Biscuits will be out of the oven in about 10 minutes. "I will take a bowl," Ezra said, tossing a coin on the bar. He sipped the whiskey slowly, feeling it burn down his throat and warm his chest. Around him, the saloon buzzed with conversation. Miners talking about their claims, a card game in the corner that was already getting heated, and near the door, the banker from the stagecoach holding court about the indignity of being stranded in this God-forsaken town. Ezra tuned it all out, focusing on his drink and waiting for his food. This was why he avoided people. Too much noise, too much drama, too many complications. Up on his mountain, the only sounds were the ones nature made, and those he understood. He was just finishing his first whiskey and considering a second when the door opened and a gust of cold wind blew in along with a woman. She was young, probably mid-20s, and she stood in the doorway for a moment as if gathering her courage before stepping fully inside. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue wool that had seen better days, and her brown hair was pulled back in a simple bun. She was not beautiful in the way of the saloon girls who worked the evening crowd, but there was something compelling about her face, something in the set of her jaw and the directness of her gaze that suggested strength of character. She looked around the saloon with frank curiosity rather than fear, and when her eyes passed over Ezra, he found himself sitting up a little straighter. She walked to the bar, ignoring the stares and muttered comments from some of the men, and spoke to Pete in a clear, firm voice. "I would like a cup of coffee, please, if you have any that is fresh." Pete looked uncomfortable. "This is a saloon, miss. You might be more comfortable over at the hotel." "The hotel is full because of the stage being delayed," she replied, "and I asked for coffee, not whiskey. Surely you can manage that without compromising my reputation or yours." Pete glanced at Ezra as if looking for support, but Ezra just shrugged. It was none of his business. Pete sighed and reached for the coffee pot that sat warming on the stove. "Suit yourself, miss. That will be 5 cents. She paid and took her cup, then looked around the saloon for a place to sit. Every table was occupied, and the few empty chairs were at tables where men were already leering at her with speculation. Ezra saw her shoulders square and knew she was about to pick the least offensive option when he heard himself say, "There is a chair here, if you need one." She turned those direct eyes on him, assessing him in a way that made him feel like she was seeing more than just his rough exterior. Then she nodded and walked over, pulling out the chair beside him and sitting down as if they had been acquainted for years. "Thank you," she said simply. "I am Grace Whitfield." Ezra Cross. He did not offer his hand, and she did not seem to expect it. She sipped her coffee and looked around the saloon with that same frank curiosity. "Quite a place," she observed. "I have never been in a saloon before. My father would have been scandalized." "Your father is not here?" "My father died 3 years ago," she said matter-of-factly. "Cholera. My mother died when I was 12, so I have been on my own for a while now." Ezra did not know what to say to that. so he said nothing. Most people felt the need to fill silence with chatter, but Grace seemed comfortable letting the quiet stretch between them. Pete brought Ezra his stew and a plate of biscuits, and Grace watched with undisguised interest as he started eating. "That looks good," she said. "I've not had a proper meal since Denver." Ezra paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth. He could feel what was coming, could sense the expectation hanging in the air, and every instinct told him to keep his mouth shut and focus on his food. But her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, and she flushed with embarrassment, and before he could stop himself, he was pushing the plate of biscuits toward her. "Help yourself. Pete always gives me more than I can eat anyway." She looked at him with surprise, and something that might have been gratitude, then took a biscuit and bit into it with obvious pleasure. "Oh, that is wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Cross." "Just Ezra. Then you should call me Grace." She finished the biscuit and looked at him more carefully. "You are not from around here, are you? Or rather, you are from here, but not from the town." It was an odd way of putting it, but accurate. "I live up in the mountains. Come down a few times a year for supplies." "A mountain man," she said, and there was no mockery in her voice, just interest. "I have read about men like you, trappers and hunters who live alone in the wilderness. It sounds wonderfully peaceful." That was not the word most people used. Lonely maybe, antisocial definitely, but peaceful? He turned that over in his mind and realized she was right. "It is," he admitted. "Quiet. No complications." "No complications," she repeated softly, as if testing the words. "That does sound appealing." She took another biscuit, and he noticed her hands were chapped and red, the hands of someone who worked hard and could not afford hand cream or gloves. "I'm on my way to California," she said. "Or I was, until the stage broke down. I have a position waiting for me there, as a teacher in a small school outside Sacramento." "That's a long way to go for a teaching position." "There was nothing left for me in Illinois," she said simply. "My father left debts when he died, and I sold everything to pay them off. Teaching was the only respectable profession open to me, and the jobs back east were all taken. So I answered an advertisement, and here I am, traveling west with everything I own in 2 carpet bags." Ezra found himself actually interested in her story, which was unusual. Most people's problems bored him or made him want to leave the conversation as quickly as possible. But Grace spoke without self-pity or drama, just stating facts as they were, and he appreciated that directness. "Is it everything you expected?" he asked. "The West?" She considered the question seriously. "It is bigger than I imagined, more open. In Illinois, you can never really see the horizon because there are always trees or buildings in the way, but here you can see forever. It is exhilarating and terrifying at the same time." She looked at him. "Do you ever get lonely up there in your mountains?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. They asked if he was crazy or what he did all winter or how he survived, but never if he was lonely. He opened his mouth to say no, of course not. He had chosen this life precisely because he did not need people. But the lie would not come. Instead, he sat there with his spoon in his hand and his stew growing cold, and realized he did not know the answer. "I did not think I was," he said slowly. "I chose to live alone. After the war, I just wanted to be away from people, away from everything." "The war," she said softly. "You fought in it?" 4 years. Joined up in 61 when I was 20, got out in 65 when it was over, saw more death than any man should see." She nodded, and he saw understanding in her eyes. "My father was a doctor. He volunteered at a hospital that treated wounded soldiers. He never talked about it much, but sometimes at night I would hear him crying in his study. I think some things are too big to put into words." "That is the truth of it," Ezra agreed. They sat in silence for a moment, and it was the most comfortable silence he had shared with another person in 8 years. Around them, the saloon continued its usual chaos, but it felt distant and unimportant. He pushed his bowl toward her. "Eat some of this. I cannot finish it anyway." She should have protested or been offended, but instead, she just picked up the extra spoon Pete had left and helped herself to a bite of stew. "This is delicious. What is it?" "Elk? I brought one down last month." "You hunted it yourself?" She sounded impressed. "That must take considerable skill." "Takes patience more than anything, knowing where they go, what they eat, how they move. You watch and you wait, and eventually they come to you. That sounds like a useful philosophy for more than just hunting, Grace observed. She took another bite of stew and sighed with contentment. I cannot remember the last time someone shared their meal with me. People have been kind on this journey, but mostly in a distant way. You know, pointing me to the right stage stop or telling me where to buy a ticket. But this, she gestured at the food between them, this is genuine kindness. Thank you. Ezra felt his chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. He wanted to tell her it was nothing, just food, no big deal. But it was a big deal, and they both knew it. Sharing a meal was intimate in a way that went beyond just feeding hunger. It was breaking bread together, making space at the table, acknowledging another person's humanity and worth. He had not done that with anyone since before the war. "You are welcome," he said gruffly, and went back to eating. They finished the meal in companionable silence, and when Pete came by to clear the dishes, he gave Ezra a knowing look that made Ezra want to punch him. There was nothing going on here. He had just shared some food with a stranded traveler, that was all. No need to make a thing out of it, but Grace was looking at him with those clear eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "Can I ask you something, Ezra? And you can tell me it is none of my business if you want." He tensed, expecting some personal question that would make him regret this whole interaction. "Go ahead. What do you do up there? In your cabin, I mean. How do you spend your time when you're not hunting or gathering supplies?" It was not the question he expected. He thought about it, trying to articulate something he had never really put into words before. "I read, mostly. Got about 30 books up there, and I go through them over and over. Work on the cabin, always something that needs fixing or improving. Smoke meat, tan hides, watch the seasons change, listen to the wind." He paused, feeling foolish. "I know that probably sounds boring to someone who's used to town life." "It sounds peaceful," she said, "like you have built a life that is exactly what you need it to be, without anyone else's expectations or demands. I think that is remarkable." Remarkable. No one had ever called his solitary existence remarkable before. He studied her face, trying to figure out if she was mocking him, but there was only sincerity there. "What about you?" he found himself asking. "What do you do for yourself? For pleasure, I mean." She smiled, and it transformed her face from merely interesting to genuinely pretty. "I read too. I love books, always have. Poetry especially. And I draw, though I'm not very good at it. I like to sketch the things I see, try to capture them on paper so I can remember them later. I did a whole series of drawings on this trip, scenes from the train and the stagecoach, landscapes, people I met." She looked a little embarrassed. "It probably sounds silly." "No," Ezra said firmly. "It sounds like you pay attention. Most people go through life half asleep, not really seeing what is right in front of them, but you see things. That's a gift." She looked at him with surprise, and he realized he meant it. In the span of less than an hour, this woman had made him think about things he usually kept locked away, made him articulate thoughts he had never shared with anyone. And somehow it did not feel invasive or uncomfortable. It just felt like conversation, real conversation, the kind he had forgotten was possible. "I should go," Grace said, though she sounded reluctant. "The boarding house said they might have a room available if someone else decided to leave on horseback, rather than wait for the stage. I need to check and make sure I have a place to sleep tonight." Ezra nodded and stood when she did, old-fashioned manners ingrained from his childhood asserting themselves. Grace gathered her shawl and prepared to brave the cold again. At the door, she turned back to him. "Thank you again, Ezra, for the meal and for the conversation. You have no idea how much I needed both today." "Safe travels," he said, and meant it. "I hope California is everything you are hoping for." She smiled at him one more time, and then she was gone, the door swinging shut behind her and leaving a blast of cold air in her wake. Ezra stood there for a moment, feeling oddly deflated, like something important had just walked out of his life before he even realized it was there. Then he shook his head at his own foolishness, paid Pete for the meal, and headed out to start the journey back up the mountain. But his feet did not take him to the edge of town where the mountain trail began. Instead, he found himself walking toward the boarding house, telling himself he just wanted to make sure she had secured a room, that he was simply being neighborly. The boarding house was run by a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who eyed him with suspicion when he walked up to the porch. "If you are looking for a room, I am full up," she said flatly. "I am not. I am looking for a woman who was supposed to check about a room. Grace Whitfield. She came in on the stage." Mrs. Hendricks's expression softened slightly. "Oh, the teacher. Poor thing. Yes, she was here. But I had to turn her away. Every bed is full with the stage passengers and some miners who came down from the hills ahead of the weather. I told her to try the hotel, but I know they are full too." Ezra felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. Where was she going to go? She said she would figure something out, mentioned maybe sleeping in the stagecoach if the driver would allow it. Mrs. Hendricks shook her head. "It is not right, a decent woman having to make do like that. But what can I do? I cannot put her out on the street, and I do not have any empty beds." Ezra turned away without another word and headed toward the stagecoach depot. He found Grace there, talking to the driver, who was shaking his head firmly. "I am sorry, miss, but I cannot let you sleep in the coach. Company rules. And even if I could, it would not be safe or proper. This is a rough town after dark." Grace's shoulders were set with determination, but Ezra could see the worry in her eyes. "I understand. Thank you anyway." The driver tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Grace standing alone beside the coach. She had her 2 carpet bags at her feet, and Ezra realized with a start that this was literally everything she owned in the world. She was alone in a strange town, with no money for a hotel, even if there were rooms available, facing the prospect of a cold night with nowhere safe to go. And it was none of his business. He should turn around and head up the mountain and forget he ever met her. Instead, he walked over and cleared his throat. She turned, and her face lit up when she saw him. "Ezra, I thought you would be halfway up your mountain by now." "Ran into Mrs. Hendricks. She said you did not get a room." Grace's smile faltered. "No, but I will figure something out. I always do." "Sleep in my camp tonight," he heard himself say, the words coming out before his brain could stop them. "I've got a good spot set up about 3 miles up the trail, sheltered and safe. I will give you my bedroll and I will sleep by the fire. Tomorrow when the stage is fixed, you can come back down." She stared at him in astonishment. "I could not possibly impose like that." "You are not imposing, I am offering. And before you start worrying about propriety, I give you my word as a gentleman that you will be perfectly safe. I am not that kind of man." Grace studied his face for a long moment, and he held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his words. Finally, she nodded. "All right, thank you. I accept your offer." Relief flooded through him, though he could not explain why it mattered so much. He picked up her carpet bag, slinging his own pack over his shoulder, and gestured toward the edge of town. "Trail starts over there. It is a good climb, but if we leave now, we will get there before full dark." They left Sweetwater behind and started up the mountain. Grace kept pace with him better than he expected, her breathing steady even as the trail steepened. She did not complain or ask to rest, just kept putting one foot in front of the other, with the same quiet determination she seemed to bring to everything. As they climbed, the noise of the town faded away, replaced by the sound of wind in the pines and their own footsteps crunching in the snow. "It is beautiful up here," Grace said after about an hour of walking. "So clean and pure, like the world just washed itself fresh." "That is what I thought the first time I came up here," Ezra admitted, "like I could breathe properly for the first time in years." "After the war?" "After everything. The war, losing my family, trying to fit back into a world that did not make sense anymore. Up here, things are simple. The mountain does not care about your past or your mistakes. It just is." Grace was quiet for a moment, navigating around a fallen log. "Is that what you wanted? For things to be simple?" "It was what I needed. I could not be around people anymore. Could not stand the small talk and the expectations and the pretending that everything was fine when nothing was fine. Up here, I did not have to pretend." "But does it ever get lonely?" she asked again, and this time Ezra knew the answer. "I did not think so until today," he said honestly. "I thought I was content, but then you sat down and started talking to me, and I realized there is a difference between being alone and being lonely. I've been alone for 8 years, but I think maybe I've been lonely the whole time and just did not know it." He heard her breath catch, and when he glanced back at her, there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. That is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I can remember. Thank you for trusting me with it. They reached his camp as the last light was fading from the sky. Ezra had set it up years ago as a waypoint between his cabin and town, a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock where he could spend the night when the journey took longer than expected. There was a fire ring already laid with wood, a stack of dry branches under a tarp, and a flat area perfect for spreading out bedrolls. He got the fire going quickly, the flames catching and spreading warmth into the cold evening air. Grace stood close to the fire, holding her hands out to the heat. "This is wonderful," she said. "I feel like I am in one of those adventure novels I used to read as a girl. Camping under the stars, a fire, the wilderness all around us. It is magical." Ezra found himself smiling despite himself. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding him of how he used to feel about the mountains before they became just another part of his routine. He pulled out the supplies he had bought in town and started preparing a simple meal of bacon and beans. Grace watched him work with interest. "Can I help?" she asked. "You can fill that pot with snow and set it by the fire to melt. We will need water for coffee." She did as he asked, moving with a natural efficiency that spoke of someone accustomed to taking care of herself. They worked together in comfortable silence, and when the food was ready, they sat on logs by the fire and ate while stars began to appear overhead. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the snow and making the whole world seem to glow. "I have never seen stars like this," Grace said softly, her neck craned back to look at the sky. "In the city you can only see a few, but here there are thousands of them, millions maybe." "Makes you feel small," Ezra said, "but in a good way. Like your problems are not as big as they seem when you have got all of that looking down at you." "Yes, exactly." She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by firelight. "Can I ask you something else? And again, you can tell me it is none of my business." "Seems to be your favorite question," he said, but there was no heat in it. "Go ahead. Do you ever think about leaving? Going back to civilization, I mean. Or does the mountain have you for good?" It was a fair question, and one he had asked himself more than once over the years. "I used to think I would stay up here until I died. That seemed like a fine plan, living out my days in peace and quiet, but lately I've been wondering if maybe I was running away rather than running to something, and you cannot run forever, even in the mountains." "What changed?" Grace asked softly. Ezra looked at her across the fire, at this woman who had appeared in his life just a few hours ago, and somehow turned it upside down with her direct questions and honest eyes. "I think maybe I just needed someone to ask me the right questions, to make me look at what I was doing instead of just doing it." "I am sorry if I have overstepped," Grace said, looking worried. "I have a terrible habit of being too direct. My father always said I would never make a proper lady because I could not learn to keep my thoughts to myself." "Do not apologize," Ezra said firmly. "I like that you say what you think. Most people spend so much time dancing around the truth that you never know what they really mean. But you are honest, and that is rare. It is valuable." Grace smiled at him, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition or understanding that went deeper than words. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks drifting up toward the stars. An owl called from somewhere in the darkness, and another answered from across the canyon. The world felt both infinite and intimate, vast and yet reduced to just the two of them in this circle of firelight. "Tell me about your family," Grace said. "If it is not too painful, I mean." Ezra was surprised to find that he wanted to talk about it, wanted to share that part of himself with her. "I had a younger brother, Daniel. He was 19 when he enlisted, full of grand ideas about glory and honor. We served in the same regiment for a while, until Chickamauga. He died there, along with most of the boys we had marched with. I held him while he bled out, and there was nothing I could do to save him. After that, something in me broke. I finished out the war because deserting would have dishonored his sacrifice, but the day I got my discharge papers, I started walking west and did not stop until I found these mountains." Grace reached across the fire and took his hand, her grip firm and warm. "I'm so sorry. That is a grief too heavy for any one person to carry alone. What choice did I have? Everyone lost someone in the war. It was not special or unique. I just had to keep going." "But you did not keep going," Grace said gently. You stopped. You came up here and you stopped living and just started existing. I think maybe Daniel would want more for you than that." The words hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He wanted to be angry, wanted to pull his hand away and tell her she did not know anything about what Daniel would want. But he could not, because she was right. Daniel had loved life with a passion that Ezra had never quite managed, had seen beauty and possibility in everything. If he could see Ezra now, living alone on a mountain, cut off from the world, he would be heartbroken. "What am I supposed to do?" Ezra asked, and was shocked to hear his voice crack. "I do not know how to be around people anymore. I do not know how to care without being afraid of losing them." "You start small," Grace said. "You take one chance, then another. You let someone sit down and talk to you, and you talk back. You share a meal. You offer shelter to a stranger. You do all the things you have been doing today, and you keep doing them until it starts to feel natural again." "That simple." "That hard," she corrected, "but possible. I know it is possible because I am doing it too. Every day since my father died, I've had to choose whether to give up or keep going, and every day I choose to keep going. Some days that choice is easier than others, but I keep making it. That is all any of us can do." They sat in silence for a while, hands still clasped across the fire. Ezra felt something shifting inside him, some wall he had built around his heart starting to crack. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you could either step back to safety or jump and hope you could fly. "Tell me about your father," he said finally, wanting to know more about her, wanting to understand the woman who had walked into his life and changed it in the span of a single afternoon. Grace's face softened with memory and love. "He was a good man, kind, patient, dedicated to helping people. He never made much money as a doctor because he never turned anyone away, even if they could not pay. My mother died bringing my little brother into the world, and the baby died too. After that, it was just my father and me. He taught me to read and think for myself, treated me like I had a brain worth developing instead of just training me to be some man's wife. When he died, I lost my best friend. You must have loved him very much. I did. I do. But I also know he would want me to build a new life, not spend the rest of my days mourning the old one. That is why I'm going to California, why I'm starting over in a place where no one knows me. It is terrifying, but it is also an adventure, a chance to become whoever I want to be." "You are very brave," Ezra said, and meant it. Grace shook her head. "I'm terrified most of the time, but I do it anyway. I think maybe that is what bravery actually is, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it." The fire was burning low, and the temperature was dropping fast. Ezra reluctantly released Grace's hand and stood to add more wood to the flames. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day for you." He spread out his bedroll near the fire and helped Grace settle into it, piling his spare blankets on top for extra warmth. He would spend the night tending the fire and keeping watch, making sure she stayed safe and warm. It had been years since he had been responsible for another person's well-being, and he found that the weight of it was not as heavy as he remembered. Instead, it felt almost natural, like falling back into a rhythm his body remembered even if his mind had forgotten. Grace lay down and pulled the blankets up to her chin, her face peaceful in the firelight. "Ezra." "Yes?" "Thank you for this, for all of it. I know you did not have to help me, and I'm grateful that you did." "I'm glad you sat down," he said simply. "I did not know how much I needed someone to talk to until you did." She smiled sleepily and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Ezra sat by the fire and watched her, this stranger who did not feel like a stranger at all. He thought about what she had said, about making the choice every day to keep going, to stay open to life even when it hurt. He thought about Daniel and how disappointed his brother would be to see him hiding on a mountain instead of living. And he thought about the fact that in less than 24 hours, Grace would be back on that stage and headed to California, and he would go back up the mountain to his solitary cabin, and their paths would never cross again. The thought made his chest ache in a way he had not felt in 8 years. He added more wood to the fire and settled in to wait out the night, his mind churning with possibilities and what-ifs. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, tracking the passage of hours, and still sleep would not come. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Ezra admitted to himself what had been growing clearer with every passing hour. He did not want Grace to leave. He did not want to go back to his solitary existence on the mountain, to his quiet days and empty nights. He wanted to hear her voice and see her smile and listen to her talk about books and beauty and all the things he had convinced himself did not matter anymore. But what could he offer her? A cabin in the wilderness, a life of isolation and hardship, a man who had forgotten how to be part of the world. She was on her way to California, to a teaching position and a new life, and he had no right to ask her to give that up for him. But what if he did not have to ask? What if there was another way? The idea that had been forming in his mind all night suddenly crystallized into clarity. It was crazy, probably impossible, and would require him to do the one thing he had sworn never to do again, take a chance on caring about someone. But as he looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully by the fire, he knew with absolute certainty that she was worth the risk. He just had to figure out how to tell her. Grace woke as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She sat up slowly, looking around with wonder at the morning light on the snow and the mountains stretching away in every direction. Ezra had coffee waiting, and he handed her a cup as she emerged from the bedroll. "Good morning. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," she said honestly. "There is something about the mountain air that just knocks you out. Or maybe it was feeling safe for the first time since I left Illinois." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You did not sleep at all, did you?" "I am used to staying awake. Comes from years of hunting and keeping watch." He busied himself with packing up the camp, avoiding her eyes. "We should head down soon. The stage will probably be ready to leave by mid-morning, and you will want to be there." "Right. California." Grace said the word like it was a foreign language she was still learning. She helped him pack, and within half an hour they were on the trail heading back down to Sweetwater. The descent was faster than the climb, and they made good time despite the snow. But there was a tension between them now, something unspoken hanging in the air. They were about a mile from town when Grace suddenly stopped walking. Ezra turned back to look at her questioningly. "I need to say something," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "And I need to say it before we get back to town and I lose my nerve." Ezra's heart started pounding. "All right." "I do not want to go to California," Grace said in a rush. "I mean, I did want to. It seemed like a good plan, a fresh start, a chance at a new life. But last night, sitting by that fire and talking with you, I realized something. I have been running too, just like you, running from grief and loss and the fear of being alone. But the thing is, I was still going to be alone in California, just alone in a different place." "Grace, let me finish," she said, holding up a hand. "I know we just met. I know this is crazy and impulsive and probably the most improper thing I've ever done. But sitting with you yesterday, talking with you, I felt something I have not felt in years. I felt like myself, not the orphan or the teacher or the poor girl who has to make her own way in the world, just Grace. And I liked that feeling. I liked who I was when I was with you." Ezra could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at her as she continued, her words tumbling out like water over rocks. "I am not asking you for anything. I know your life is up in those mountains, and I respect that. But I have been thinking, and maybe there's a way I could stay here. In Sweetwater, I mean. There must be children who need teaching, even in a small town like this. I could find a way to make it work, and then maybe we could see each other sometimes when you come down from your mountain. We could talk and share meals and see if this feeling between us is real or just two lonely people finding each other at the right moment." She stopped, breathing hard, her cheeks flushed with color. "You can tell me I am crazy. You can tell me to get on that stage and go to California like I planned. But I had to tell you how I felt, because I have learned the hard way that life is too short for regrets." Ezra took 3 long steps forward and cupped her face in his hands. She looked up at him with wide eyes, hope and fear warring in her expression. "You are not crazy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Or if you are, then I am too. Because I spent all night trying to figure out how to ask you to stay. I was going to suggest the same thing, that you could find work in Sweetwater and I could come down from the mountain more often and we could get to know each other properly. But I was afraid you would think I was a fool for even suggesting it. I would never think that, Grace whispered. You are the least foolish person I have ever met. I do not have much to offer you, Ezra said, needing her to understand what she would be getting into. I am rough and unsocialized, and I have spent 8 years learning how to live alone. I do not know if I can change that, or if I can be the kind of man you deserve, but I want to try. You make me want to try. I do not need you to change, Grace said firmly. I just need you to be willing to let me in, to give us a chance to see what this could become. I can do that, Ezra said. And then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and it felt like coming home after years of wandering in the wilderness. Her lips were soft and warm, and she made a small sound of surprise and pleasure that sent heat flooding through his veins. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard and grinning like idiots. So we are really doing this? Grace asked, laughter in her voice. We are really doing this, Ezra confirmed. You are staying in Sweetwater, and I am going to court you properly, assuming you will have me. I will have you, Grace said. But what does courting look like when you live on a mountain? I guess we will figure that out as we go, Ezra said. He took her hand and they started walking toward town again, but everything felt different now. The world was brighter, the air clearer, and the future suddenly full of possibilities instead of just empty days stretching into empty years. When they reached Sweetwater, Ezra walked with Grace to the boarding house and helped her explain her situation to Mrs. Hendricks. The older woman was skeptical at first, until Ezra vouched for Grace's character and offered to pay for her room until she found work. Mrs. Hendricks softened when she learned Grace was a teacher, and mentioned that the town had been talking about starting a school for years but could never find anyone willing to take on the task. You should talk to Reverend Mitchell, Mrs. Hendricks suggested. He has been the most vocal about getting a school started. I'm sure he would be thrilled to hear that a qualified teacher has landed in our laps. Grace's eyes lit up with hope and excitement. Do you think he would see me today? I am sure of it. His church is just down the street. You cannot miss it, only building in town with a steeple. Grace turned to Ezra with a brilliant smile. Will you come with me? Wouldn't miss it, he said, and meant it. Reverend Mitchell turned out to be a young man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an earnest manner. He nearly fell over himself when Grace explained her qualifications and her interest in staying in Sweetwater to teach. Within an hour, they had worked out the basics of an arrangement. The town would provide a small building that was currently being used for storage, and Grace would be paid a modest salary plus room and board. It was not much, but it was enough to live on, and Grace accepted with gratitude. When can you start? Reverend Mitchell asked eagerly. I need a few days to get settled and prepare lesson plans, Grace said. Shall we say next Monday? Perfect, absolutely perfect. I will spread the word and make sure the parents know to send their children. Oh, this is wonderful news. The town has needed a school for so long. They left the church in high spirits, and Grace practically bounced down the street. I cannot believe it worked out so perfectly. It is like it was meant to be. Maybe it was, Ezra said. He felt lighter than he had in years, like some enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I need to head back up the mountain to get my cabin ready for winter, but I will be back down in a week to check on you. Make sure you are settling in all right. Grace stopped and turned to face him, suddenly serious. A week seems like a very long time. It does, Ezra agreed, but I need to take care of some things, and you need to get your classroom ready. We will both be busy. Promise you will come back? He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and feeling her melt against him. I promise. Nothing could keep me away. They stood like that for a long moment, reluctant to separate. Finally, Ezra forced himself to let go and step back. I should get going before it gets dark. Be safe, Grace said, and Ezra, thank you for everything. Thank you for sitting down and talking to me, he said. You changed my life in the span of a day. I did not know that was possible. He left before he could change his mind and decide to stay, knowing that if he did not go now, he would never leave. The journey up the mountain felt different this time, less like an escape and more like a temporary retreat. His cabin was waiting for him, cold and dark, but as he got the fire going and started his evening routine, he found himself smiling, because in a week he would go back down and see Grace again, and that was something to look forward to. The next 7 days passed in a blur of activity. Ezra worked harder than he had in years, cutting extra firewood, smoking meat, repairing the roof, and chinking the gaps in the walls. He found himself talking out loud as he worked, imagining conversations with Grace, telling her about what he was doing and why. It should have felt foolish, but instead, it felt natural, like she was already a part of his life, even though she was miles away. On the morning of the 7th day, he bathed in his tin tub, even though the water was cold enough to make him gasp, trimmed his beard carefully, and pulled his hair back in a neat queue. He dressed in his best shirt, the one he usually saved for trading days, and checked his appearance in the small mirror that hung by the door. He looked nervous and excited, and about 20 years younger than he had just a week ago. The journey down the mountain seemed to take forever. He forced himself not to run, to maintain a steady pace, but his heart was racing with anticipation. What if she had changed her mind? What if the week apart had made her realize this was all a mistake? But when he walked into Sweetwater and saw her coming out of the general store with her arms full of books and supplies, all his doubts evaporated. She saw him, and her face transformed with joy. She dropped her packages and ran toward him, and he caught her up in his arms and swung her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, she grabbed his face and kissed him thoroughly, not caring who saw. "You came back," she said when they finally broke apart. "I promised I would," Ezra said. "Did you doubt me?" "Not for a second, but seeing you is still the best thing that has happened all week." She took his hand and led him toward the building that would serve as her school. "Come see what I have done. The town has been amazing. Everyone pitched in to help get it ready." The school was small but clean, with rough-hewn benches for the students and a proper desk for Grace at the front. Someone had donated a chalkboard, and Grace had already written the alphabet across it in neat letters. Books lined a shelf along one wall, donated by various families. It was humble, but it was full of potential. "This is perfect," Ezra said honestly. "The children will be lucky to have you." "I start tomorrow," Grace said, and he could hear the nervousness in her voice. "Reverend Mitchell says there are about 15 children who will be coming, ranging from 6 years old to 14. I have lesson plans ready, but I'm still terrified that I will mess it all up." "You will not," Ezra said firmly. "You are smart and kind and dedicated. Those children will love you." They spent the afternoon together, walking around town and talking about everything and nothing. Ezra told her about his week on the mountain, and Grace shared stories about getting to know the people of Sweetwater. They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, a luxury that made Grace's eyes go wide, and Ezra felt a fierce satisfaction at being able to treat her to something special. "I have been thinking," Grace said over dessert, "about how we make this work. You coming down from the mountain every week or two seems like a lot of travel, especially once winter really sets in." "I do not mind the travel if it means seeing you," Ezra said. "I know. But I was thinking, maybe eventually I could come up to your cabin, see where you live, how you spend your days. If we are going to build something together, I want to understand that part of your life too." The thought of Grace in his cabin, sharing his space and his solitude, was both thrilling and terrifying. "It is not much to see. Pretty rough compared to what you are used to." "I slept in your camp under the stars and thought it was wonderful," Grace reminded him. "I'm not afraid of rough. I just want to be with you." "Then yes," Ezra said. "Whenever you are ready, I will take you up the mountain." They established a pattern over the next few weeks. Ezra would come down to Sweetwater twice a week, staying overnight at the boarding house and spending as much time with Grace as her teaching schedule would allow. He helped her with projects at the school, fixing broken benches and installing better shutters on the windows. He got to know the town better, and while he still preferred the solitude of his mountain, he found that he did not hate being around people as much as he remembered. Or maybe it was just that Grace made everything better, made him want to be part of the world again instead of hiding from it. One evening in early December, as they sat together in the schoolhouse after the children had gone home, Grace brought up something that had clearly been on her mind. "The town is having a Christmas social in 2 weeks. There will be music and dancing and food. Everyone is invited." She looked at him hopefully. "Would you consider coming? With me?" Ezra felt his stomach clench with the old familiar anxiety. A social meant crowds and noise and small talk, all the things he had been avoiding for 8 years. But he looked at Grace's hopeful face and thought about what she had said that first night, about making the choice every day to keep going, to stay open to life. "I will come," he said, and watched her face light up. "But I'm warning you, I'm a terrible dancer." "I do not care," Grace said, throwing her arms around his neck. "I just want to be there with you, to have you meet people and be part of the community. You have been hiding for so long, Ezra. I think it is time to come out of the shadows." The social was held in the largest building in town, the warehouse that usually stored mining equipment, but had been cleared out and decorated with pine boughs and candles for the occasion. Ezra felt profoundly uncomfortable the moment he walked in, but Grace held his hand tightly and introduced him to everyone they met with such genuine pride that he could not help but stand a little taller. People were surprisingly friendly, thanking him for the improvements he had made to the school and asking about life in the mountains with genuine interest rather than mockery. When the music started, Grace pulled him onto the makeshift dance floor. He had not danced since before the war, and he was indeed terrible at it, stepping on her feet and losing count of the steps. But Grace just laughed and held him close, and eventually he relaxed enough to enjoy the feeling of holding her in his arms and moving together to the music. "See," she whispered in his ear, "not so bad, is it?" "It is not bad at all," he admitted. "You were right. I have been hiding, and I think I was ready to stop." After the dance, they stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was clear and cold, with stars brilliant overhead. Ezra pulled Grace close to keep her warm, and she rested her head against his chest. "I love you," she said softly. "I know it is fast and crazy, but I do. I love you, Ezra Cross." His heart felt like it might burst. "I love you too. I have loved you since that first day when you sat down and started talking to me like I was worth talking to. You saved my life, Grace. You brought me back from wherever I had gone." She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "You saved mine too. I was so scared and so alone, and you gave me hope. You gave me a home." "Marry me," Ezra heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere deep inside that he thought had died years ago. "I know it is too soon, and I do not have much to offer, but marry me anyway. Be my wife, and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Grace was crying openly now, but she was smiling too. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you. I do not care that it is soon or that we do not have much. I care that you see me and I see you, and that we make each other better. That is enough. That is everything." They were married 3 weeks later in Reverend Mitchell's church, with half the town in attendance. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Hendricks had helped her alter, and Ezra wore his best clothes and tried not to shake as he said his vows. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra kissed Grace with all the love and hope and gratitude he felt, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. The question of where they would live had been discussed at length. Grace needed to be in Sweetwater for her teaching, but Ezra's life and livelihood were in the mountains. They decided on a compromise. They would spend the school year in a small house they rented in town, and when summer came, they would go up to the cabin for the months when Grace did not have classes. It was not a perfect solution, but it would allow them to be together, which was all that mattered. Their first year of marriage was an adjustment. Ezra struggled with being in town so much, with the noise and the people and the constant demands on his attention. But Grace was patient, and she created a sanctuary in their small house where he could retreat when things got overwhelming. And to his surprise, he found that teaching alongside Grace, helping her with the children and watching her bring education and hope to the next generation, gave him a sense of purpose he had not felt since the war. When summer came and they finally made the journey up to his cabin, Grace fell in love with the mountains as completely as she had fallen in love with him. She spent her days exploring and sketching while he hunted and fished, and their evenings were spent reading to each other by firelight or simply sitting in comfortable silence and watching the sun set over the peaks. She made the cabin feel like a home in a way it never had before, adding small touches like curtains on the windows and wildflowers in a jar on the table. "I understand now why you loved it up here," she said one evening as they sat outside watching the stars emerge. "It is like the whole world falls away and there is nothing but the present moment, no past to regret, no future to worry about, just now." "It was enough for me for a long time," Ezra said, "but it is not enough anymore. I need you in the mountains. I need the cabin in the schoolhouse. I need the solitude in the community. You taught me that I do not have to choose one or the other, that I can have both if I am willing to work for it." "We will work for it together," Grace said, taking his hand. "That is what marriage is, right? Building a life together piece by piece, day by day." Their second summer in the mountains brought an unexpected development. Grace discovered she was pregnant, and Ezra found himself terrified and thrilled in equal measure. The thought of being responsible for a child, of having someone so precious and vulnerable depending on him, brought back all his old fears about loss and grief. But Grace was steady and confident, and her certainty helped calm his anxiety. "Children are a risk," she told him when he confessed his fears. "But love is always a risk. You could choose to hold back, to protect yourself from the possibility of pain, but then you miss out on all the joy and beauty that comes from caring deeply about someone. And I think you know that now. You have taken the risk with me, and it has been worth it. This will be worth it too." Their son was born in February of 1876, delivered by Mrs. Hendricks with Ezra pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door. When he was finally allowed to enter and saw Grace holding their baby, exhausted but radiant with joy, something in him healed that he had not even known was broken. He held his son for the first time and felt the weight of 8 years of isolation and grief finally lift from his shoulders. They named him Daniel, after Ezra's brother, and the baby became the center of their world. Ezra discovered that fatherhood suited him in ways he never expected. He loved watching his son grow and change, loved teaching him about the mountains and the woods, loved seeing Grace's smile reflected in Daniel's small face. The cabin had to be expanded to accommodate their growing family, and Ezra spent his summers building new rooms and making improvements, creating a home that would hold all of them comfortably. Grace continued teaching during the school year, bringing Daniel with her to the classroom when he was small and letting him play while she worked. The children loved having a baby around, and Daniel grew up surrounded by laughter and learning. When he was old enough to sit still, he joined the other students, learning his letters from his mother and his wilderness skills from his father. 3 years after Daniel's birth, Grace gave birth to their daughter, Sarah. She had Grace's direct gaze and Ezra's dark hair, and she was as stubborn as both of her parents combined. Ezra adored her completely. The cabin was expanded again, and their summers in the mountains became family adventures, with both children learning to fish and hunt and navigate the wild country that had once been Ezra's solitary domain. Tom Murphy, who still ran the trading post, liked to joke that Ezra had gone from the most antisocial man in the territory to the most domesticated. But Ezra did not mind the teasing. He knew what his life had been before Grace, and he knew what it was now, and there was no comparison. He had thought he was content in his solitude, had convinced himself that he did not need anyone or anything beyond his mountain and his solitude. But he had been wrong. He had been lonely without knowing it, had been slowly dying inside without realizing it, until Grace sat down next to him and started talking and brought him back to life. Sweetwater grew over the years, transforming from a rough mining town into a proper community. Grace's school expanded, eventually requiring a second teacher, and she became known throughout the territory as a dedicated educator who had transformed countless lives. Ezra became a respected member of the community, serving as a guide for newcomers and teaching hunting and wilderness skills to young men preparing to make their own way in the mountains. He still preferred the quiet of the high country, still spent his summers in the cabin with his family, but he no longer felt the need to hide from the world. Their children grew strong and capable. Daniel inherited his father's love of the mountains and his mother's sharp mind, deciding at 16 that he wanted to be a doctor and traveling east for medical school. Sarah became a teacher like her mother, taking over the Sweetwater School when Grace finally decided to retire. Both children married and had children of their own, filling Ezra and Grace's later years with grandchildren to spoil and stories to tell. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Ezra took Grace back up to the mountain where he had first offered her shelter. They camped in the same spot where they had shared their first meal together, and as they sat by the fire watching the stars, Grace rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "giving up your solitary life for all of this chaos and complication?" "Never," Ezra said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Grace. I thought I was fine alone, but I was just existing, not living. You taught me the difference." "You taught me the same thing," Grace said. "I was running away from grief and loss, trying to start over in a place where no one knew me. But you saw me, really saw me, and you made me realize that I did not need to run. I just needed to find someone worth staying for. I am glad you stayed, Ezra said, pulling her closer. I'm glad you sat down and started talking to me that day. Best decision I never made. Grace laughed. You made it. You offered me a place at your table. That was the first step. Then I am glad I did, Ezra said. Everything good in my life started from that moment. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the wind in the pines. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, but everything else had transformed. Ezra was no longer a lonely man hiding from the world. He was a husband, a father, a grandfather, a member of a community. He had built a life rich with love and connection, and all of it traced back to a single afternoon when a woman with honest eyes and a direct manner had sat down beside him and asked him if he ever got lonely. The answer, he knew now, had been yes. He had been lonely without knowing it, had been living half a life without realizing it was possible to live fully. But Grace had shown him another way, had taken his hand and led him back into the world, and he had never looked back. As they grew older, Ezra and Grace settled into a peaceful rhythm. They spent their winters in Sweetwater, close to family and friends, and their summers in the mountain cabin where they had found so much joy over the years. Ezra's hair turned silver, and Grace's face acquired lines that spoke of laughter and love. Their bodies slowed down, but their minds stayed sharp, and they still read to each other every evening, still talked about books and ideas and all the mysteries of the world. Sarah brought her children to visit every summer, and the cabin rang with the sound of young voices. Ezra taught his grandchildren the same skills he had taught his own children, passing down knowledge of the mountains and the wilderness that had sustained him for so many years. Grace told stories, sang songs, and made sure every child knew they were loved and valued. The cabin that had once been a lonely refuge became a gathering place, filled with warmth and life and the best kind of chaos. Daniel returned from his medical training and set up practice in Sweetwater, drawn back to the place where he had grown up. He married a wonderful woman named Catherine, and they gave Ezra and Grace 3 more grandchildren to adore. The family grew and expanded, creating connections and relationships that stretched across the territory and beyond. One evening in late summer, when Ezra was 74 and Grace was 67, they sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Grace's hand was clasped in his, her fingers intertwined with his own, and Ezra felt a contentment so deep it almost hurt. This is what happiness looks like, Grace said softly. Right here, right now, everything we have built together. I never imagined I could be this happy, Ezra admitted. After the war, after losing Daniel, I thought that was it. I thought I had used up all my chances at joy, but I was wrong. Life gives us second chances if we are brave enough to take them, Grace said. You were brave enough to let me in even when you were scared. That is the kind of courage that matters most. You made it easy, Ezra said. From that very first moment, you made it easy to care. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars appeared. Inside the cabin, they could hear Sarah preparing dinner and the grandchildren playing a noisy game. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and vast, witness to their love story and all the years they had shared. Thank you for sitting down and talking to me that day, Ezra said, echoing words he had spoken 1,000 times over the years, but never tired of saying. Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving. Thank you for being worth saving, Grace replied, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for building this life with me, for being the partner I needed, even when I did not know I needed one. The following spring, Ezra suffered a fall while working on the cabin roof. He broke his hip and several ribs, and while he recovered, his body never quite regained its former strength. He could no longer make the long trek up to the cabin without help, and his hunting days were behind him. But he did not rail against the limitations of age. He had lived a full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return, had raised good children and seen them raise good children of their own. That was enough. That was everything. Grace's health remained strong, and she continued teaching part-time, running a small reading circle for women in town and tutoring children who needed extra help. She made sure Ezra stayed active and engaged, dragging him to social events and family gatherings even when he grumbled about it. but they both knew he did not really mind. He had learned to love the community almost as much as he loved his solitude, and he appreciated the balance Grace maintained between the two. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered in Sweetwater for a celebration. Children and grandchildren came from across the territory, filling the house to bursting. There was music and laughter and so much food that the tables groaned under the weight of it all. Ezra stood in the middle of the chaos, Grace at his side, and looked around at all the faces he loved, all the lives they had touched and been touched by in return. "Quite a legacy," Daniel said, coming to stand beside his father. "You should be proud." "I am," Ezra said simply. "Your mother and I built something good here, something that will last." "Because you were willing to take a chance," Daniel said. "Mom told me the story of how you met, how you almost did not speak to her that first day. Can you imagine if you had just kept to yourself? None of this would exist." Ezra shook his head, the thought almost incomprehensible. "I do not want to imagine that. It would have been a terrible waste. The best decision I ever made was offering your mother a seat at my table." "She says the best decision she ever made was accepting," Daniel replied with a smile. "We were both right," Ezra said. "That is the secret of a good marriage. Both people have to keep choosing each other every single day. Your mother and I have been doing that for 40 years now, and I plan to keep doing it for as long as I am breathing." The celebration continued late into the night, and when everyone finally went home or found places to sleep scattered throughout the house, Ezra and Grace sat together on the porch in the darkness. They could hear the soft sounds of their family sleeping inside, could feel the love and connection that bound them all together. 40 years, Grace said softly. "Sometimes it feels like just yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have been together forever." "It has been a good 40 years, Ezra said. "The best years of my life." "Mine too," Grace agreed. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "I am glad I decided to stay in Sweetwater. I am glad I took a chance on a grumpy mountain man who did not know how lonely he was." "I knew deep down," Ezra said. "I just did not want to admit it, but you made me face it, made me see what I was missing. And then you stayed and built a life with me, even though I had nothing to offer you but a cabin in the wilderness and a heart that had forgotten how to love." "You had everything to offer," Grace corrected gently. "You had honesty and strength and a capacity for love that just needed to be awakened. You were worth the risk, Ezra. You have always been worth it." They sat together until the sky began to lighten with dawn, reluctant to let the anniversary end. But eventually, Grace stood and stretched, pulling Ezra up with her. "Come on, old man. We have a whole family to feed breakfast, and then we have the rest of our lives to enjoy together." "The rest of our lives," Ezra repeated, liking the sound of it. "I can live with that." The years continued to pass, gentle and precious. Ezra's body grew more frail, but his mind stayed sharp, and he spent his days reading, telling stories to his grandchildren, and sitting with Grace in the sunshine. They could no longer make the journey up to the mountain cabin, but Daniel and Sarah made sure it was maintained, promising to keep it in the family for future generations. One afternoon in late autumn, when the leaves were turning gold and the air held the first crisp promise of winter, Ezra and Grace sat together in their small house in Sweetwater. Grace was reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice still clear and strong despite her years. Ezra listened with his eyes closed, content and peaceful. "That was beautiful," he said when she finished. "Read it again." Grace smiled and turned back to the beginning of the poem, but halfway through she noticed that Ezra's breathing had changed, had grown shallow and slow. She set the book aside and took his hand, her heart clenching with love and fear. "Ezra?" He opened his eyes and looked at her, and his gaze was clear and calm. "I love you, Grace. I've loved you from the moment you sat down and started talking to me. You gave me a life worth living." "I love you too," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "So much. Forever." "Forever," Ezra agreed. His eyes drifted closed again, and his breathing slowed, and then stopped. Grace sat with him for a long time, holding his hand and crying quietly, mourning the loss but also grateful for every moment they had shared. The funeral was held 3 days later, and it seemed like the whole territory turned out to pay their respects. Ezra was buried in the cemetery overlooking the mountains he had loved, under a headstone that read, Ezra Cross, beloved husband, father, and friend. He chose to live fully. Grace lived for another 6 years, staying active and engaged with her family and community. She continued teaching, continued reading and drawing, continued making sure that Ezra's legacy lived on through their children and grandchildren. She visited his grave every week, sitting beside the headstone and talking to him about everything and nothing, keeping him updated on family news and her own daily adventures. When her own time came, on a quiet spring morning with flowers blooming and birds singing, she went peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face. She was buried beside Ezra, and her headstone read, "Grace Cross, beloved wife, mother, and teacher. She saw what others missed." Their story became part of local legend, the tale of a lonely mountain man and a stranded teacher who found each other at exactly the right moment and built a life of love and purpose together. Their cabin in the mountains became a family retreat, passed down through generations, and every summer the descendants of Ezra and Grace would gather there to remember the two people who had started it all. Daniel's daughter, named Grace after her grandmother, made the journey up to the cabin with her own children one summer day. She stood on the porch where her grandparents had spent so many peaceful evenings and told her children the story of how it all began. "Your great-great-grandfather was a mountain man who lived alone," she said. "He thought he was happy by himself, but he was really just lonely and did not know it. And then one day, your great-great-grandmother sat down next to him in a saloon and started talking, and everything changed. He learned that he did not have to be alone, and she learned that she had found a place to belong. And from that one conversation, from that one moment of courage and connection, all of us came to be." The children listened with wide eyes, enchanted by the romance and adventure of it all. Young Daniel, named for his great-great-grandfather, asked the question that was on all their minds. "Do you think they were happy?" Grace smiled and looked out at the mountains that rose around them, eternal and beautiful. "I think they were the happiest people who ever lived, because they found each other when they needed it most, and they chose to build something beautiful together. That is what love is, really. Choosing each other every single day and building a life that honors that choice." The children nodded solemnly, understanding in the way that children do when something important is being said. They spent the rest of the day exploring the cabin and the surrounding woods, and that night they sat around a fire just like Ezra and Grace had done so many years before, watching the stars and feeling connected to the past and the future all at once. The story of Ezra and Grace lived on, passed down through generations, a reminder that it is never too late to change your life, never too late to open your heart to love, never too late to admit that you are lonely and reach out for connection. Their legacy was not just the family they created, though that was precious. It was also the example they set, the proof that courage and honesty and choosing to see the best in people could transform everything. Ezra had thought he knew what his life would be, alone on his mountain until the day he died. But Grace had shown him another way, had sat down and started talking and opened up a whole world of possibility. And he had been brave enough to listen, brave enough to care, brave enough to risk his heart one more time. That bravery had given him 40 beautiful years with the woman he loved, a family that spanned generations, and a life full of meaning and connection. It had started with a simple moment, a woman sitting down in a rough saloon and asking for coffee, and a man who had almost said nothing but instead offered a chair. From that small act of kindness, from that moment of connection, everything else had flowed. A courtship, a marriage, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a cabin in the mountains and a home in town, summers of solitude and winters of community. A love that had lasted through decades and would echo down through generations. And it had all begun because a mountain man who did not know he was lonely finally had someone sit down and start talking to him. And he realized in that moment everything he had been missing. Everything he could have if he was just brave enough to reach out and take it. He had reached out. She had stayed. And together they had built something beautiful, something lasting, something worth remembering. That was the legacy of Ezra and Grace Cross, And it lived on in every child who played in the cabin, in every couple who took a chance on love, in every person who chose connection over isolation and hope over fear. Their story was proof that it was never too late, that love could find you even in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the person you need most is the one brave enough to sit down beside you and simply start talking. And that was exactly what Grace had done on a cold November day in 1873, in a rough Montana town, in a saloon that smelled of tobacco and whiskey. She had sat down, she had started talking, and she had changed everything.